Before I became a psychologist, I was a police officer. And I'll tell you what I used to think each time a woman came in giving a fragmented, contradictory, tearful account of what her partner had done to her. I often thought she just needed mental health support. Her partner, on the other hand, would behave in a calm, measured way. He was often worried about her, and he was really easy to believe. It took years of training and a complete rethinking of what I thought that I was looking at in order for me to actually understand it. And I actually had it exactly backwards, and that's what today's about. So the women who end up in a therapy room for coercive control, they don't usually arrive with that on their referral. Usually they'll arrive carrying someone else's diagnoses or their label. And it's usually something along the lines of anxiety, perimenopause, neurodivergence, sometimes borderline personality disorder or bipolar. Sometimes there's more than one label at once. Now, on the surface, none of those labels are strictly wrong. There's usually weight loss or weight gain, disrupted sleep, memory problems, emotional dysregulation, and a great deal of difficulty trusting her own judgment. Now, a doctor looking at that picture will usually land on something like stress or hormonal reasons or mood disorders. Now, those aren't, as I said, strictly wrong observations, but they are the wrong conclusions about where the problem is coming from, because no one has actually asked or answered that one question that changes the whole picture. What is she going home to every night? And then there's the reason that she's actually come into the therapy room. Part of the reason often that she's been referred in the first place. Partners in coercively controlling relationships, they frequently will suggest, or at least actively encourage, that their partner seek help. Often it's framed as being concerned, but what it does is it functions as deflection. She's sent to deal with what is, in his framing at least, her problem. And often the referral pathways, the systems tend to accept that framing without questioning too deeply. So let's talk about what the presentation actually is. That fragmented memory, those recall issues, the self-doubt, the self-blame, some emotional dysregulation, a feeling of brain fog. Now these are not personality traits. They are what sustained exposure to psychological coercive control produces. Now, trauma-informed practice has been very clear on this for decades. Chronic psychological stress actually degrades memory consolidation. It disrupts our capacity to make clear decisions. Now, this isn't any kind of metaphor either. It is actually neurological. There's a specific mechanism at work, and it's called cognitive dissonance. And that's just where our human minds, they can't hold two contradictory truths. On the one hand, our minds will tell us that this person loves me. And on the other hand, there's another thought that this person is harming me. And they both occur simultaneously. And that's not without significant cost. So how our minds try to resolve that tension is usually by minimising the harm, because accepting the alternative that the person that you love is choosing to hurt you, that can feel close to unbearable. So that resolution in trying to resolve that contradiction, that's actually what produces that brain fog, those memory difficulties. The confusion that women describe when they try to explain what's happening to them, even to themselves, becomes completely disjointed, fragmented, and just not particularly clear. Now, research recently published this year in 2026 by Goodman-Williams and colleagues, published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, examined 655 women who had each sought medical forensic care after a sexual assault. Found that women with complete memory loss were 55% less likely to report to police. Now that mechanism is directly relevant to when we're living inside a coercively controlling relationship. When a woman can't give a clear, confident, linear, chronological account of what's been happening to her, she's less likely to report, less likely to be believed, and more likely to question whether her own experience was real at all. Now, this isn't any kind of character failing within the woman. It is a documented consequence of the psychological and emotional harms of coercive control itself. Now, I want to share with you a case that I have worked on. Now, I'm going to change details, names, professions to protect the identity of this particular client. Rebecca, she was a 35-year-old teacher. She loved her work and apparently was very, very good at it. Now, she's been married to Brian for 3 years, and together they'd had a child that was just over 12 months old. She came into my clinic and she's presenting with trust issues. She doesn't feel like herself anymore. She's struggling to regulate her emotions, feeling irritable one moment, sad the next, anxious the next. She started losing weight, yet her appetite hasn't changed. She's dealing with insomnia. Her memory is unreliable, and her doctor has suggested that it's stress-related. She starts to believe that perhaps it's even burnout from the work that she's doing, and she's considering giving up her job. Now, by the time I see her, she has already arrived at the conclusion that something is wrong with her. Not with Brian, not with the relationship, with her. Brian's pattern is recognisable once you know what to look for. Every time Rebecca was raising a concern about his behaviour, and this was particularly happening since she'd gone back to work after maternity leave, each time she'd bring up with him about him not contributing to parenting and to the household, and about the impact that that had on her, he'd start to stonewall her, or he'd turn his back on her. He started telling her that she was going crazy, just like her sister had. He told her that she just needed to try harder. He also told her that if she continued to complain, that he might have to think about leaving the relationship. Now, what that installs over time is a woman who has already argued herself out of her own experience before she even opens her mouth in front of anybody else. Now, she doesn't say, "He's doing this to me." She says instead, "I don't know, maybe I'm just not coping." Now, the perpetrator, the one that's actually causing the harm, in this case Brian, doesn't even need to be in the room. The self-doubt is already travelling with her. Now, going back to where we started, the police context. Now, this is the dynamic I was responding to before I understood what coercive control actually produced. A woman giving a fragmented, confused, tearful, contradictory account. We'd often typically read that as being an unreliable historian or witness, somebody in need of mental health support. She'd be dismissed. Her partner, on the other hand, the one that was calm, measured, and genuinely worried about her, or so it seemed, was really easy to believe. He was also often the one that was doing the harm. Now, I want to be really careful here about what I'm saying to you. This isn't primarily a story about incompetent professionals. Their responses actually make sense given the presentation. It's a story about what coercive control is specifically designed to create. Now, a version of her that is difficult to believe, a version of him that's easy to trust. It becomes the architecture, the structure. It's not accidental. What it is harm. This is why Wise Woman Studio resources begin with an explicit focus on working with adult women. In Australia, where I'm from, in New South Wales alone, 4 in 5 people that are killed in intimate partner homicides are women. And 99% of those women were the victim in the relationship. They weren't the perpetrator of the harm. Now, by contrast, 73% of men killed by an intimate partner were actually the abuser in the relationship. There are comparable patterns that hold true across the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. This is not a claim that coercive control only affects women, or that it only occurs in heterosexual relationships. It doesn't. It's common to all people and all relationships. And the relationship clarity mapping framework for coercive control actually applies across relationship types. But these resources are designed for the people who bear the documented weight of it most acutely. And the data is consistent on who that actually is, women. Now, the relationship clarity map that is part of the overall framework, it's a structured mapping tool that we've designed to do one specific thing. What it does, it builds an external, accumulating record of the patterns over time within your own relationship. So rather than relying on a memory that's been progressively undermined by installed self-doubt, that indoctrination that happens over time, a woman can start to see the pattern documented in front of her. She can start to connect her partner's behaviour to her own responses across multiple incidences over weeks, over months. And those patterns, as they become visible independently of whether she currently trusts her own account, whether she learns to trust her own memory. And that shift really matters. When the pattern is documented externally, when it's visible in front of her, the question she starts to ask herself, it changes. It moves from, did this happen or am I imagining it? And it becomes, here is when it happened. Here is what preceded it. Here is what it did to me. And that shift, it isn't small. The relationship clarity mapping framework, it doesn't replace therapy. Therapy is actually often an essential next step for processing the pain and the grief of what coercive control has done. It also isn't a domestic violence or crisis service, though it's designed to support women in recognising the patterns that may warrant seeking those services or to have the language to explain it. It's a clarity tool. It establishes the recognition that makes the next steps possible. Now, if what I've described today sounds familiar, if you've been handed a diagnosis or several that just don't quite fit, and if your own experience doesn't make sense to you anymore, if you've been told repeatedly that the problem is you, it may be worth considering and looking at the pattern rather than the labels. Now, there's a free coercive control screening tool at the Wise Woman Studio website. It's a starting point for exactly that. The link is in the description. I'll see you next time. Take care.